Hello, my name is Janet Morrison. I'm a lawyer and professional land conservation consultant with 20 years experience in the conservation field, including 15 years as Executive Director of North County Land Trust. I'd like to talk with you today about conservation restrictions. A conservation restriction is a way that you can conserve your land while continuing to use it and own it as you have in the past. How does a conservation restriction work and how does it affect your land? Basically, a conservation restriction eliminates the development rights from your land so that it can never be developed. How does it affect your land? Well, obviously, with a conservation restriction on your land, you can't develop it. If you have no restriction, yes, you can, subject to local zoning bylaws. With a conservation restriction, you can use it for many open space uses, including recreational uses, timber harvesting, farming, etc. With no conservation restriction on your land, all of those uses are available to you, plus others, subject to local zoning. Can you sell or lease your land with a conservation restriction on it? Yes, you can do both, subject to the conservation restriction and its terms. For most conservation restrictions, there is no limit on the resale price of your land under restriction. There is such a limit, however, in the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. Without a conservation restriction on your land, you can sell and lease it free of any restriction. Public access is generally required on restricted land if you have received any state or federal funding to conserve your land. But we try very hard to make that public access reasonable, both for you and for users of your land. We try to keep access away from any homes or buildings, especially if you are living on your land, and we can often restrict access to certain trails. Obviously, if you are a private landowner, you do not have to allow public access on your land. What kind of open space uses are allowed on restricted land? Well, most of the ones that you have already been doing. Forestry is allowed, subject to state law, and that's true for owners of unrestricted land as well. Farming, obviously, is also allowed, subject to local zoning. Hunting and fishing, subject to state and local law, and passive recreation, with the exception being recreational motor vehicles. Trails are common, and of course, if you have a working landscape, meaning that you have a forested property where you do timber harvests, or you own a farm, you are entitled to use motor vehicles to manage your property. What are the requirements for a conservation restriction? First, your land has to have some kind of natural resource value. In New England, we have different types of landscapes. We have forests and farms and wetlands, fields, rivers, ponds, and all of these have natural resource values. They all provide wildlife habitat and environmental benefits. You also have to have an eligible holder of the conservation restriction. This means that the person to whom, or the entity to whom you convey the conservation restriction, is qualified and eligible to hold it. That would mean a land trust or your local conservation commission. It could be also a state or even a federal agency. The conservation restriction must be reviewed and approved by the state. This is done in Boston at the Division of Conservation Services. They use a model conservation restriction, which we adapt for your particular property and your particular needs. The conservation restriction is conveyed like a deed, and it's recorded with the Registry of Deeds. The conservation restriction is permanent. What are the benefits of having a conservation restriction on your land? Well, for one thing, it is permanently conserved and protected and can never be developed by anyone after you are gone. You can continue to use your land for many open space uses, as we've seen. You can sell a conservation restriction on your land, and this is true for many people, even large landowners, who must cash out some of the value of their land. A conservation restriction is an excellent way to cash out the development value of land, which is sometimes very significant, while retaining ownership of the land and continuing to use and enjoy it. Some landowners also donate a conservation restriction on their land, and they can receive significant tax benefits. Tax deductions and tax credits for the donation of a conservation restriction in Massachusetts. We have the Conservation Land Tax Credit Program, where you can receive 50% of the value of the conservation restriction in cash in the year following your donation. This is done by filing a Massachusetts income tax return with a special number on it indicating that you have participated in the tax credit program. The cash value is up to $75,000, so 50% of value up to a maximum of $75,000. In addition, for the same donation, you can receive a conservation easement tax incentive on the federal side. This is an enhanced charitable deduction where you can deduct the full value of the conservation restriction against 50% of your taxable income for up to 16 years. This means that the donor of a fairly valuable conservation restriction who has even modest income would be able to recoup much of that value or even all of that value over the 16-year carry-forward period. Finally, I want to encourage you to consider placing a conservation restriction on your land. It provides benefits to the land. It ensures that it is never developed. It allows you to continue to use and enjoy your land. It allows you to sell your land for any value with the conservation restriction on it. It keeps your land in the local property tax rolls, and as an aside, you should always continue to enroll your property in the Chapter 61 program if you put a conservation restriction on it. That's the only way the tax assessor knows how to properly tax your property. So in closing, I'd say it's a great way to conserve your land, and I would be happy to talk with you further if you want to contact me. My contact information is on the first slide.